And so it needs a much deeper rethink. And there needs to be, again, to go back to this point, deeper and more robust inclusivity around decision making, so that it doesn't come to the point where you could take your life into your hands by going and protesting against a government.
Some have become, whether they become captured, many civil society actors have now become auditioning grounds for politics and to catch the eye of politicians, and for which reason you're seeing a growth of what we are calling social movements. And I think that the nature of social movements that depend less on maybe donor funding, that are less beholden to the politics of the day, are not civil, in fact, with the system, and are not very keen. We do civic initiatives. All these things that bring attention to social problems become an offshoot of a broader mobilization. And I think the problem with many African countries,
these petitions been successful?
And that's a very critical point. And this is what shows the frustration of a system that is built on exclusion and refusal to learn. An avalanche of these initiatives that would make them buckle down under the pressure and teach them the new reality of forceful democratic participation that the young people are demanding. But I do think that if countries wanted to be more responsive to how young people communicate and how young people express themselves politically and democratically, we have to be able to increase the democratic pathways for participation. Declan gives an example, which I agree with, is the question that we have been tormented about around police violence and police brutality and extrajudicial killings around protests. What the ginger is for me in terms of how we go forward. But mobilizing young people will and continue to do, and we better make space for that, I think.
Thank you. One question from our audience to Declan Garvin. Even when policy changes are achieved, what challenges do youth movement face in ensuring these policies are effectively implemented?
So I think we need to recognize globally, but certainly in referring to that's going to happen in perpetuity until we start having more inclusion. And again, we're talking about youth, but that's just one element of society. It's also about gender. It's about ethnic minorities. It's about people with different orientation. It's about people with different political attitudes. And until state power is confident enough and mature enough to allow more African nations are accumulating, is that there's such a narrow field in which decisions are made in terms of how much to lend to certain countries, what the conditions are, and what those interest rates are. And there needs to be a broader rethink and a broader conversation on other kinds of indicators that need to be used to assess kind of the kind of creditworthiness of these countries made in the future. Africa is the most dynamic, diverse, compelling continent, I think, in the world. And we're still treating it with frameworks from the 1980s and policies from the 1990s. And it just really needs to stop.
Oliver, as
understanding what it takes. Sure, there's a significant number of people that believe that the way forward is to, as Nigerians say, Japan, meaning that to leave the countries, which is a resignation in itself. But there's so many people that are still left behind that have the hope that they can engage. It is not a new concept. It is not something being reimagined. Every society ought to change. But what I am most concerned about is the increase in gulf that exists between those who lead us and those who young people are. That wide gap, or that gap, is wider in Africa than everywhere else. If you take Ghana, for instance, you have a president who is making the social and political space to bring young people into the process. But as we are bringing young people into the process as well, we have to understand the problem is not only domestic, but it's also a global problem. There are global problems around, lending and financing of African states. There are problems around trade. From what young people are demanding, I can see great enthusiasm and a desire for change that we can take forward.
I'll go back to Michael Odwo, African News journalist from Kenya. Michael, all roads entering and exiting
cities like Mombasa, Nakuru, Nairobi, and other small towns. And this is just a culmination, like our guest had said, it's not just the tax issue or the tax increase that the regime of President Ruto is trying to push through. It's about also other issues. And so when you saw yesterday, again, the opposition leader saying they'll recall the MPs who voted yes for this finance bill, and it's a result of many other issues that I just mentioned. And therefore, we expect in the next few days, because the government is still watching the situation as it unfolds. They're trying to see, and because we also have some people who've been arrested, a few protesters who've been brought forward to the court, and some of them have been released, some of them are still in custody, some have different business premises. Therefore, the government is still watching as it unfolds, and of course, respect court orders, and furthermore create jobs, and on top of this, reduce your taxes. And on top of this, reduce your taxes. And these are some of the things that we are still yet to see if the government will try to
calls now for the president William Ruto to resign, and the president, the government, they insist that they now need to borrow money. It is the only way for them to plug the deficit. The deficit.
Week, right, and they're overdue. So the first is he needs to provide reassurance to the public that he's genuinely listening and that he's genuinely taking their concerns, which are clearly articulated under the finance bill, and connect those changes to the grievances and frustrations that protesters have. And the third thing that he needs to do is kind of what we say in Kenya. He needs to humble himself. And so what needs to happen is he kind of needs to begin to approach the public hat in hand, take responsibility for the failings of his government, and then provide the assurances in line with their expectations on how things will change moving forward.
Of course, for your insights as well.
Thank you.
That wraps this inaugural episode of Africa News, The Debate with me, Lauriane Bofokana, but the discussion continues on all our platforms and on AfricaNews.com. Bye for now.
A whole new territory for innovation.